Welcome back, everybody. This is Yoko, and today we have the 12th session of the Book of Enoch, and it's going to be a little bit long as far as the recording goes. We're going to go about 24 minutes of recording. I mean the cover area, and anyway, so I will hand it over to you, LG. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Yoko. It's good to be back. Yeah, we are, this is kind of a long section. And so before we lead off with the prayer, I thought I might just kind of tee it up a little bit, in my opinion, in my interpretation, to kind of help you, because this is going to talk about bulls, animals, sheep, wolves, and that's not really what it is. These signify different eras of time and different historical figures. So the first section that we're going to get is the bulls. And just to remember that the white bull is Noah. And, you know, you're going to see black bulls, red bulls, this, that, and the other, but that white bull is Noah. And then you're going to, as we go from the bulls, we're going to go to the sheep. And so just remember, you know, the sheep, and this is going to be kind of Moses, the parting of the Red Sea, the summit of the rock where he went and did the 10 Commandments, being lost in the desert, finally leading them to promised land. The sheep is Moses and those people, and the wolves are, you know, the Pharaoh that got drowned by the Red Sea when it came back together. And then we're going to move on, but I think this may be after we stop, but I want to go ahead and say it to kind of give you the transition, because this is the transition of the timeline. We went from Noah, then we're going into the sheep, which is, you know, Moses, and then of course we're going to go into Jesus. So when the ram rises up, the prince, the leader, you know, that's the era of Jesus and the disciples. So I think that may help the listening just a bit, to kind of just know that we're not really talking about animals. And what you'll see is in the white bulls, when we're dealing with Noah, we also have the archangels, and we have the Nephilim, and that whole scenario. So that's one way you can kind of see that. So I didn't want that to get lost in there, because that's really an important aspect of it. And we're going to go through the whole ark, the flood, the ark, the angels helping Noah build the ark. All of this is communicated within this parable using animals, because it was a vision. And so with that, I think I'll do the Lord's Prayer, and then you can start the recording, Yoko. So let's pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And deliver us not from evil, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. And tonight, the chapters, it will be chapter 83 to chapter 89.77. Okay, and I'm going to start. we'll be pausing at 2 hours and 29 minutes in chapter 89.36.
That's perfect, Yoko. I know you're bringing it up. Thank you.
And now, my son Methuselah, I will show you all the visions that I saw, recounting them before you. 2 visions I saw before I took a wife, and neither one was like the other. For the first time when I learnt the art of writing, and for the second time before I took your mother. I saw a terrible vision, and concerning this I made supplication to the Lord. I had lain down in the house of my grandfather, Malalel, when I saw in a vision how heaven was thrown down and removed, and it fell upon the earth. And when it fell upon the earth, I saw how the earth was swallowed up in a great abyss, and mountains were suspended on mountains, and hills sank down upon hills, and tall trees were torn up by their roots, and were thrown down and sank into the abyss. And then speech fell into my mouth, and I raised my voice to cry out and said, "The earth is destroyed." And my grandfather Malalel roused me, since I lay near him, and said to me, "Why did you cry out so, my son, and why do you moan so?" And I recounted to him the whole vision which I had seen, and he said to me, "A terrible thing you have seen, my son. Your dream vision concerns the secrets of all the sin of the earth. It is about to sink into the abyss and be utterly destroyed. And now, my son, rise and make supplication to the Lord of glory, if you are faithful, that a remnant may be left on the earth, and that he may not wipe out the whole earth. My son, from heaven all this will come upon the earth, and upon the earth there will be great destruction." And then I rose and prayed and made supplication, and wrote my prayer down for the generations of eternity, and I will show everything to you, my son Methuselah. And when I went out below and saw the sky, and the sun rising in the east, and the moon setting in the west, and some stars, and the whole earth, and everything as he knew it since the beginning, then I blessed the Lord of judgment, and ascribed majesty to him. For he makes the sun come out from the windows of the east, so that it ascends and rises on the face of heaven, and follows the path which has been shown to it. And I raised my hands in righteousness, and I blessed the Holy and Great One. And I spoke with the breath of my mouth, and with the tongue of flesh, which God has made for men born of flesh, so that they might speak with it. And he has given them breath, and a tongue, and a mouth, so that they might speak with them. Blessed are you, O Lord King, and great and powerful in your majesty, Lord of the whole creation of heaven, King of kings, and God of the whole world. And your kingly authority, and your sovereignty, and your majesty will last forever, and forever, and ever. And your power for all generations. And all the heavens are your throne forever, and the whole earth your footstool forever, and ever, and ever. For you made and you rule everything, and nothing is too hard, and no wisdom escapes you. It does not turn away from your throne, nor from your presence. And you know and see and hear everything, and nothing is hidden from you, for you see everything. And now the angels of your heaven are doing wrong, and your anger rests upon the flesh of men until the day of the great judgment. And now, O God, Lord, and great King, I entreat and ask that you will fulfill my prayer to leave me a posterity on earth, and not to wipe out all the flesh of men, and make the earth empty so that there is destruction forever. And now, my Lord, wipe out from the earth the flesh that has provoked your anger, but the flesh of righteousness and uprightness establish as a seed-bearing plant forever. And do not hide your face from the prayer of your servant, O Lord. And after this I saw another dream, and I will show it all to you, my son. And Enoch raised his voice and said to his son Methuselah, To you I speak, my son, hear my words, and incline your ear to the dream vision of your father. Before I took your mother Edna, I saw a vision on my bed, and behold, a bull came out of the earth, and that bull was white. And after it a heifer came out, And with the heifer came 2 bullocks, and one of them was black and the other red. And that black bullock struck the red one and pursued it over the earth, and from then on I could not see that red bullock. But that black bullock grew, and a heifer went with it. And I saw that many bulls came from it, which were like it, and followed behind it. And that cow, that first one, came from the presence of that first bull, seeking that red bullock, but did not find it. And then it moaned bitterly and continued to seek it. And I looked until that first bull came to it and calmed it, and from that time it did not cry out. And after this she bore another white bull, and after this she bore many black bulls and cows. And I saw in my sleep that white bull, how it likewise grew and became a large white bull. And from it came many white bulls, and they were like it. And they began to beget many white bulls that were like them, one following another. And again I looked with my eyes as I was sleeping, and I saw heaven above, and behold, a star fell from heaven, and it arose and ate and pastured among those bulls. And after this I saw the large and the black bulls, and behold, all of them changed their pens and their pastures and their heifers, and they began to moan one after another. And again I saw in the vision, and looked up at heaven, and behold, I saw many stars, how they came down, and were thrown down from heaven to that first star, and fell amongst those heifers and bulls. They were with them pasturing amongst them. And I looked at them and saw, and behold, all of them let out their private parts like horses, and began to mount the cows of the bulls. And they all became pregnant, and bore elephants, camels, and asses. And all the bulls were afraid of them, and were terrified in front of them. And they began to bite with their teeth, and to devour and to gore with their horns. And so they began to devour those bulls, and behold, all of the sons of the earth began to tremble and shake before them, and to flee. And again I saw them, how they began to gore one another, and to devour one another, and the earth began to cry out. And I raised my eyes again to heaven, and saw in the vision, and behold, there came from heaven beings that were like white men, and 4 came from that place, and 3 others with them. And those 3 who came out last took hold of me by my hand, and raised me from the generations of the earth, and lifted me up onto a high place, and showed me a tower high above the earth, and all the hills were lower. And one said to me, Remain here until you have seen everything which is coming upon these elephants and camels and asses, and upon the stars, and upon all the bulls. And I saw one of those 4 who had come out first, how he took hold of that first star which had fallen from heaven, and bound it by its hands and feet, and threw it into an abyss. And that abyss was narrow and deep and horrible and dark. And one of them drew his sword, and gave it to those elephants, camels, and asses, and they began to strike one another, and the whole earth shook because of them. And as I looked in the vision, behold, one of those 4 who had come out cast a line from heaven, and gathered and took all the large stars, those whose private parts were like the private parts of horses, and bound them all by their hands and their feet, and threw them into a chasm of the earth. And one of those 4 went to a white bull, and taught him a mystery, trembling as he was. He was born a bull, but became a man, and built for himself a large vessel, and dwelt on it. And 3 bulls went with him in that vessel, and they were covered over. And again I raised my eyes to heaven, and saw a high roof with 7 water channels on it. And those channels discharged much water into an enclosure. And again I looked, and behold, springs opened on the floor of that large enclosure, and water began to bubble up, and to rise above the floor. And I looked at that enclosure until its whole floor was covered by water. And water, darkness, and mist increased on it. And I looked at the height of that water, and that water had risen above that enclosure, and was pouring out over the enclosure, and it remained on the earth. And all the bulls of that enclosure were gathered together, until I saw how they sank, and were swallowed up and destroyed in that water. And that vessel floated on the water, but all the bulls, elephants, camels, and asses sank to the bottom, together with all the animals, so that I could not see them. And they were unable to get out, but were destroyed, and sank into the depths. And again I looked at that vision until those water channels were removed from that high roof, and the chasms of the earth were made level, and other abysses were opened. And the water began to run down into them until the earth became visible, and that vessel settled on the earth, and the darkness departed, and light appeared. And that white bull who became a man went out from that vessel, and the 3 bulls with him. And one of the 3 bulls was white, like that bull, and one of them was red as blood, and one was black. And that white bull passed away from them. And they began to beget wild animals and birds, so that there arose from them every kind of species: lions, tigers, wolves, dogs, hyenas, wild boars, foxes, badgers, pigs, falcons, vultures, kites, eagles, and ravens. But amongst them was born a white bull. And they began to bite one another, but that white bull, which was born amongst them, begat a wild ass and a wild bull with it, and the wild asses increased. But that bull which was born from it begat a black wild boar and a white sheep, and that wild boar begat many boars, and that sheep begat 12 sheep. And when those 12 sheep had grown, they handed one of their number over to the asses, and those in turn handed that sheep over to the wolves, and that sheep grew up amongst the wolves. And the Lord brought the 11 sheep to dwell with it, and to pasture with it amongst the wolves, and they increased, and became many flocks of sheep. And the wolves began to make them afraid, and they oppressed them until they made away with their young. And then they threw their young into a river with much water. But those sheep began to cry out because of their young, and to complain to their Lord. But a sheep which had been saved from the wolves fled and escaped to the wild asses. And I saw the sheep moaning and crying out and petitioning the Lord with all of their power, until the Lord of the sheep came down at the call of the sheep from a high room, and came to them and looked at them. And he called that sheep which had fled from the wolves, and spoke to it about the wolves, that it should warn them, that they should not touch the sheep. And the sheep went to the wolves in accordance with the word of the Lord, and another sheep met that sheep and went with it. And the 2 of them together entered the assembly of those wolves, spoke to them, and warned them that from then on they should not touch those sheep. And after this I saw the wolves, how they acted even more harshly towards the sheep, with all of their power, and the sheep called out. And their Lord came to the sheep and began to beat those wolves, and the wolves began to moan, but the sheep became silent, and from then on they did not cry out. And I looked at the sheep until they escaped from the wolves, but the eyes of the wolves were blinded, and those wolves went out in pursuit of the sheep with all of their forces. And the Lord of the sheep went with them as he led them, and all his sheep followed him. And his face was glorious, and his appearance terrible and magnificent. But the wolves began to pursue those sheep until they met them by a stretch of water. And that stretch of water was divided, and the water stood on one side, and on the other before them. And their Lord, as he led them, stood between them and the wolves. And while those wolves had not yet seen the sheep, they went into the middle of that stretch of water. But the wolves pursued the sheep, and those wolves ran after them into that stretch of water. But when they saw the Lord of the sheep, they turned to flee in front of him. But that stretch of water flowed together again, and suddenly resumed its natural form, and the water swelled up and rose until it covered those wolves. And I looked until all the wolves that had pursued those sheep were destroyed and drowned. But the sheep escaped that water, and went to a desert where there was neither water nor grass. And they began to open their eyes and see, and I saw the Lord of the sheep pasturing them, and giving them water and grass, and that sheep going and leading them. And that sheep went up to the summit of a high rock, and the Lord of the sheep sent it to them. And after this I saw the Lord of the sheep standing before them, and his appearance was terrible and majestic, and all those sheep saw him and were afraid of him. And all of them were afraid and trembled before him, and they cried out to that sheep with those who were in their midst, "We cannot stand before our Lord, nor look at him." And that sheep which led them again went up to the summit of that rock, and the sheep began to be blinded, and go astray from the path which had been shown to them. But that sheep did not know. And the Lord of the sheep was extremely angry with them, and that sheep knew, and went down from the summit of the rock, and came to the sheep, and found the majority of them with their eyes blinded, and going astray from the path. And when they saw it, they were afraid, and trembled before it, and wished that they could return to their enclosure. And that sheep took some other sheep with it, and went to those sheep that had gone astray, and then began to kill them. And the sheep were afraid of it. And that sheep brought back those sheep that had gone astray, and they returned to their enclosures. And I looked there at the vision until that sheep became a man, and built a house of the Lord of the sheep, and made all the sheep stand in that house. And I looked until that sheep, which had met that sheep that led the sheep,
Thank you, Yoko.
Thank you.
Well, who thinks we were talking about sheep, bulls, wolves, dogs, and rams?
Very exciting word imagery.
Yes, let's not forget about the fallen angels who are referenced as stars in the whole private part conversation there. Would y'all like to talk about it, or do you want me to do a quick rundown, or what you want to do?
Do your special thing that only you can do.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hear it.
Okay. Well, these are crazy notes, but let's see. So this is the Book of Visions. This is the parable. And there's more than these two visions, but right now these are the two visions that he had before he was a married man, before he married Edna. And so his first vision came to him, don't know exactly how old he was, but he was with Malala. I'm probably saying that wrong, but his grandfather. So he must have been, young enough. But he saw the vision where heaven fell upon the earth and that the whole earth was destroyed. And it was just such a terrible vision that he cried out. And then he, explained that to his grandfather. And basically, his grandfather told him he had been shown all the secrets of the sins of the earth. And then we kind of move on to where when we get to 84.3, we start getting into the angels. So there's that vision. But remember, the reason for the flood was because of the fallen angels. So what he saw in that vision when the earth fell into itself and was destroyed was the flood. So it moves nicely into 84.3. And this is just like what we've heard. The angels go to God and say, you know everything, you see everything, you see that the angels are doing wrong. What are we going to do about it? And so then we go into the second dream. So the first dream wasn't that long. It basically was just showing him that the earth was going to be destroyed. And then we go into the second dream there, but it's still before he's married. And that's when we start talking about the bulls. And that's where there's a lineage. And Yoko, I did put an image on your wall, which kind of shows the first 7 generations lineage, because it'll help you with this part. But so I believe, in the best way that I can interpret it, that first white bull, it was Adam. And then it says, and there was a heifer. That was Eve. And then it said that they have 2 bullocks. Sorry, I was getting in a little quieter place. I didn't want to So they have two bullocks. One's red, one's black. So that's Cain and Abel. Cain's the black one, Abel's the red one. And then from there, they talk about another white bull and another white bull. You know, that could have been Lamech. It could have been the first Seth. Not Noah's Seth, but the first Seth from Adam and Eve. So I don't know exactly who those are, but it's the good guys. But you can see that every now and then it's like a white bull went with a black bull. And then that's where the problems started happening. And then it says that the stars fell from heaven. And that's where the fallen angels are really introduced. And then it said more stars were cast down and joined those that were already down. So those were the leaders, the 20 leaders, and then there 200 that came with them. And this is where they went and took wives, like we know what we've learned so far, and that they all became pregnant. Now, the offspring, which we call the Nephilim, in here they're referenced as elephants, camels, and asses. But it says that they start devouring everything, and that the sons of the earth tremble and flee, and that the earth cried out. So we're right back to Archangel Michael saying, you know all and you see all, but yet you don't tell us what to do. And then it says that beings came from heaven that were white like men, so they were angelic. They glowed, glittered, you know. It said 4 of them and then 3 more. So those 4 are your 4 main archangels: Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Phanuel. The other 3 are the ones that actually lifted Enoch up, and they tell him, you remain here and you watch what happens to this pasture. And then Enoch witnesses the same thing we've already learned. It says that one of the 4, so one of the 4 archangels, drew his sword and bound the first star, chained the black bull in the abyss. And then they gave the swords to the elephants, camels, and asses. So this is what we've learned when God says that part of the fallen angels' punishment before they're bound is they're going to be forced to watch their offspring kill themselves. That's what this is. The archangels give the swords to the Nephilim, the camels, elephants, and they use them on one another. And then it says another angel cast a line from heaven and bound the stars, which are the fallen angels, by their hands and feet, and cast them down into a chasm. And then we're introduced to Noah. Here comes another white bull, and that's Noah. And it says that basically the angels helped Noah build the ark. He saw the flood coming, and that all the bulls, camels, asses all sank and were destroyed, and that the ark settled. And then it says from that ark, that white bull went out. That was Noah. And with him, 3 other bulls. This is Noah's 3 sons. Says the first one was white, like that other white bull. That is Seth, the second Seth, Noah's Seth. Our Seth. We are from Seth. The other 2, one was red, one was black. The black one is Ham. Remember, Ham's wife is how we think Cain's lineage survived the ark. As soon as look, I might as well call him Cain. As soon as Ham got off the ark, he went back to the wicked ways of sacrificing and worshiping idols. He did not want to go into the new way. And then it starts talking about the sheep and the wolves, and we know that that's Moses. We know that he went up on the mount. That's what he says. It calls it here a summit of the rock, and that some were going astray. And at this point, it could be the burning bush incident, although only Noah saw that. But it does pretty much state that some of the sheep saw God's face, and they were unable to look into his glory, basically. But they were going astray. They were lost in the desert. They finally made it to the promised land. So we know that story. But then it starts getting ready for Jesus, and it's like it's off and on. Men were trying to do right. Some were, some wouldn't. Something would happen, and they would get them all back on track and get all the sheep doing right again, and then they would lose it. And then something would get them back on track, and this just went back and forth, back and forth. And then it gets into where we're going to pick up next. We're starting to hear about the dogs and the foxes. So we're going to kind of a different time. We're going more to when Jesus was on the earth. It's going to talk about the ram, the prince, and the leader, and that was Jesus. It's going to talk about how the dogs try to oppress the sheep. You know, that's good and bad. The dogs are bad, the sheep are good in this instance. But I think that's about where we ended, so we'll pick up once we get through. Does that create any questions or comments, thoughts?
No, that you put it perfectly. It's like you organized it and explained it. Thank you so much. That's great.
Yes, that was quite a zoo of animals that you had to sort through.
Well, thank you. Well, I guess then if I did okay, we can move on. And this is kind of a shorter part, so I think we just kind of need to have the Jesus on the brain, and I feel like that's where it's going to go. I'm not as familiar yet with the few parts coming up, but I'm sure we'll get through them together. So, Yoko, whenever you're ready.
The sheep fell asleep there at the vision until that sheep became a man, and built a house of the Lord of the sheep, and made all the sheep stand in that house. And I looked until that sheep, which had met that sheep that led the sheep, fell asleep. And I looked until all the large sheep were destroyed, and small ones arose in their place, and they came to a pasture, and drew near a river of water. And that sheep that led them, which had become a man, separated from them and fell asleep, and all the sheep saw it, and cried out very bitterly over it. And I looked until they left off crying for that sheep, and crossed that river of water. And there arose all the sheep that led them, in place of those which had fallen asleep, and they led. And I looked until the sheep came to a good place, and a pleasant and glorious land, and I looked until those sheep were satisfied, and that house was in the middle of them in that green and pleasant land. And sometimes their eyes were opened, and sometimes blinded, until another sheep rose up, led them, and brought them all back, and their eyes were opened. And the dogs, and the foxes, and the wild boars began to devour those sheep, until the Lord of the sheep raised up a ram from among them, which led them. And that ram began to butt those dogs, foxes, and wild boars on one side and on the other, until it had destroyed them all. And the eyes of that sheep were opened, and it saw that ram in the middle of the sheep, how it renounced its glory, and began to butt those sheep, and how it trampled on them, and behaved unbecomingly. And the Lord of the sheep sent the sheep to another sheep, and raised it up to be a ram, and to lead the sheep in place of that sheep which had renounced its glory. And it went to it and spoke with it alone and raised up that ram and made it the prince and leader of the sheep. And during all of this, those dogs oppressed the sheep. And the first ram pursued that second ram, and that second ram rose and fled before it. And I looked until those dogs made the first ram fall. And that second ram rose up and led the small sheep, and that ram begat many sheep and fell asleep. And a small sheep became a ram in place of it, and became the prince and leader of those sheep. And those sheep grew and increased, but all the dogs and foxes and wild boars were afraid and fled from it. And that ram butted and killed all the animals, and those animals did not again prevail amongst the sheep, and did not seize anything further from them. And that house became large and broad, and for those sheep a high tower was built on that house for the Lord of the sheep. And that house was low, but the tower was raised up and high. And the Lord of the sheep stood on that tower, and they spread a full table before him. And I saw those sheep again, how they went astray and walked in many ways and left that house of theirs. And the Lord of the sheep called some of the sheep and sent them to the sheep, but the sheep began to kill them. But one of them was saved and was not killed, and it sprang away and cried out against the sheep. And they wished to kill it, but the Lord of the sheep saved it from the hands of the sheep, brought it up to me, and made it stay. And he sent many other sheep to those sheep to testify to them and to lament over them. And after this I saw how when they left the house of the Lord of the sheep and his tower, they went astray in everything, and their eyes were blinded. And I saw how the Lord of the sheep wrought much slaughter among them in their pastures, until those sheep invited that slaughter and betrayed his place. And he gave them into the hands of the lions and the tigers and the wolves and the hyenas, and into the hands of the foxes, to all the animals. And those wild animals began to tear those sheep in pieces. And I saw how he left that house of theirs and their tower, and gave them all into the hands of the lions, so that they might tear them in pieces and devour them, and into the hands of all the animals. And I began to cry out with all my power, to call the Lord of the sheep, and to represent to him concerning the sheep, that all the wild animals were devouring them. But he remained still, although he saw, and he rejoiced that they were devoured, swallowed up, and carried off. And he gave them into the hands of all the animals for food. And he called 70 shepherds, and cast off those sheep, so they might pasture with them. And he said to the shepherds and to their companions, Each one of you from now on is to pasture the sheep, and do whatever I command you. And I will hand them over to you, duly numbered, and I will tell you which of them are to be destroyed, and destroy them. And he handed those sheep over to them. And he called another, and said to him, Observe and see everything that these shepherds do against these sheep, for they will destroy from among them more than I have commanded them. And write down all the excess and destruction which is wrought by the shepherds, how many they destroy at my command, and how many they destroy of their own volition. Write down against each shepherd individually all that he destroys. And read out in front of me exactly how many they destroy of their own volition, and how many are handed over for destruction, so that this may be a testimony for me against them, so that I may know all the deeds of the shepherds, in order to hand them over for judgment. And I will see what they do, whether they abide by my command with which I have commanded them, or not. But they must not know this, and you must not show this to them, but only write down against each individual in his time all that the shepherds destroy, and bring it all up to me. And I looked until those shepherds pastured at their times, and they began to kill and destroy more than they were commanded, and they gave those sheep into the hands of the lions. And the lions and the tigers devoured and swallowed up the majority of those sheep. And the wild boars devoured with them, and they burnt down that tower and demolished that house. And I was extremely sad about that tower, because that house of the sheep had been demolished, and that I was unable to see whether those sheep went into that house. And the shepherds and their companions handed those sheep over to all the animals, so that they might devour them, Each one of them at his time received an exact number, and for each of them, one after the other, there was written in a book how many of them were destroyed. And each one killed and destroyed more than was prescribed, and I began to weep and moan very much because of those sheep. And likewise, in the vision, I saw that one who wrote how each day he wrote down each one that was destroyed by those shepherds. And he brought up and presented the whole book to the Lord of the sheep, everything they had done, and all that each of them had made away with, and all that they had handed to destruction. And the book was read out in front of the Lord of the sheep. And he took the book in his hand, read it, sealed it, and put it down. And after this I saw how the shepherds pastured for 12 hours, and behold, 3 of those sheep returned, and arrived, and came and began to build up all that had fallen down from that house. But the wild boars hindered them so that they could not. And they again began to build as before, and they raised up that tower, and it was called the High Tower. And they began again to place a table before the tower, but all the bread on it was unclean and was not pure. And besides all this, the eyes of the sheep were blinded, so they could not see, and their shepherds likewise. And they handed yet more of them over to destruction, and they trampled on the sheep with their feet, and devoured them. But the Lord of the sheep remained still, until all the sheep were scattered abroad, and had mixed with them, and did not save them from the hands of the animals. And that one who wrote the book brought it up, showed it, and read it out in the dwelling of the Lord of the sheep. And he entreated him on behalf of them, and petitioned him, and he showed him all the deeds of their shepherds, and testified in front of him against all the shepherds. And he took the book, put it down by him, and went out. And I looked until
Thank you, Yoko.
Thank you.
Do your thing, LG.
Okay, one second. Okay. This one was shorter, but I don't know that I've really got it totally figured out yet. So I'm still doing my timeline thing, which I probably give more attention to that than I should. But, we went through like a ram, and then we went through some more rams, and then we went through them raising a tower. That made me think of, because there's 2 different towers that get raised here. So, what I'm wondering is like the first part of this is still kind of like that Babylon, when they raised the Tower of Babylon, Gilgamesh, all of that. I'm trying to think about that timeline, but I'm also trying to think about the 596 and when that would come in, because there's also another tower that's raised. But you can hear, once again, we're talking about giving them into the hands of the hyenas. So, we still have just ravaging going on. And then it talks about 7 shepherds and companions are appointed to pasture the sheep. And then there was one person who was to watch over those 70 shepherds and companions. Now, I believe that one person that's watching over them is also the one person who's recording it in the book that I'm going to talk about. And I always get his name wrong. I think this may be that Progabel, whatever his name. But anyway, he tells him to watch over the shepherds and, keep a tally if they destroy more sheep than what they are supposed to. And that he's to record the deeds of the shepherds. Now, a lot of people, if you're thinking of this as sheep, then you're going to be like, why are they just handing these sheep over for sacrifice? It's not that. This is about free will, the deeds of the shepherds. So it's looking at how the shepherds are leading their herds, but also it's the free will. That's what the deeds of the shepherd are. It's not that, okay, you can only have 50 sheep and you took 55. This is about free will. That's why he's saying just sit back, don't get involved. You're not to do anything but watch and record what they do. And those that exercise their free will to follow me, the Creator, and love me, then you write that down about them. And those that don't want to follow me and want to go and do wicked things and be impious, then you write that down. And then you're going to seal up that book, and then you're going to read it to me. And so that's what happens. And then they talk about he's just recording in the book of life, and then there's all this devouring going on again. And then it talks about they burnt and destroyed that house, and that house made me very sad. So I think that this, could be like what we would think of as the temple that was built, but whatever it was good, and it was destroyed. And then he says, and it saddened everyone who was observing to see that each one killed more than they were prescribed. So that means each person they were observing was sinning. And that was sad to them. And then it says that the archangel wrote it all down, and then the Lord of the sheep. So at this point, it's either Jesus or God or both, however you want to look at that, had the archangel read the book out loud in front of him and seal it. And then after the book was sealed, it says that 3 sheep arose and were raised up. And then it goes on. I mean, just nobody can get it together. It's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then it tells us another tower, a high tower was erected. So, when I think about the timeline, it's like, does that bring us here? If the first one was Babylon, is the second one, the tower we have now, which is the deep state. So it talks about the shepherds and the sheep being blinded. So before this time, the sheep were blinded. Now there's a distinction in that the sheep and the shepherds are blinded. But yet the Lord remained still. He did not do anything about it, but once again he asked for the book to be read. And then he took it, and then he went out, and that's kind of where we ended. And so all of this is based on free will, the book of life. Are you doing good? Are you doing bad? Are you taking more than your, slice of the pie out there? Are you harming people? Or are you helping people? So that's what I think that particular, or those chapters of the parable refer to, is that free will. And, because Jesus has already came and we already know what to do, so are we doing it? And that's what I think that's about. What do y'all think? Your thoughts?
Well, it's always hard to do better than what you've already just presented. It all makes sense.
Well, that's good feedback. That's good.
I have a question, LG, or Aria, if anybody can add. So what does it mean? Meaning they're blinded. I know it's all metaphor, but what the blinded. I mean, the sheep are blinded. The wolves were blinded. What does it mean?
Kind of like forgive them, for they know not what they do. In a way, it's like, I mean, I could very easily equate that to what we're going through right now. And it's like, we're trying to wake up people to the truth. Some people don't have the eyes to see or the ears to hear because it's still sealed for them. Remember, we always talk about Daniel the prophet sealing the book. How many times did we just see that this archangel reads the book, seals it, reads the book, seals it? And some people, it could be those who have not, done the work they need to do with God and Jesus, so they're asleep. But even if that's not exactly right, it's kind of something like that, I would think.
Well, that's what kind of came to me too. It's very much like what we're going through right now. And it's interesting that the word sheep was chosen this day and time for those that are sleeping, but we're still trying to lead them and guide them and herd them and take care of them and forgive them. And when they do open their eyes, even just a little bit, we're going to be there to love them and inform them.
That's right. Well, Yoko, even though this was a longer video session than we used to have with the 24 minutes, we pulled it off in the hour. So that was pretty good planning on your part.
Well, I'm so happy with your explanation of the passages with the session. And would you say it's a good time to stop?
Yeah, I think so. Seems to be a natural place to stop. And yeah.
And we will meet again sometime next week. I don't know when. Next week will be Thanksgiving. So thank you again for being here, and happy Thanksgiving. All right. Good night.
Thank you, Yoko. Thank you, LG.
You're welcome. Thank you both. And we'll see you either right before or right after Thanksgiving, depending on Yoko's schedule. And we'll get it fitted in. And we're coming down the home stretch, aren't we, Yoko? So happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving and good night.
Good night.
Good night.